going to talk about the role of a council planner and the main elements of a planner's technical report. The scope of the role of the council planner I think is really well thought of in terms of project management. We'll address this separately, but council planners take their assigned development application and really deal with it all the way through, from that initial pre-application advice through to when it's actually been submitted as an application, and then afterwards. The council planner writes a report, whether that's to a delegated authority like the senior statutory planner or the manager of the planning division, or go to some sort of aldermanic committee or even full aldermanic meeting. The council planner deals with appeals, so if their particular development application that they've written a report on goes to appeal, then they need to appear as an expert witness. Hopefully that council planner doesn't have a lot of contact with aldermen, so one of the important principles is that planning is kept separate from politics, and aldermen have quite a different role within council than the council staff do. Aldermen can be required to make a decision about a planning permit, but that can be very tricky because they're also wearing a political hat. So they're both the planning authority and they're also a political person within that local government area. So hopefully there is very limited contact between the council planner and the alderman, except in that formal aldermanic meeting where aldermen have a chance to ask the assessing officer about particular aspects of the report. In a big council, there'll also be council experts on things like land contamination. In smaller councils, this might need to be done outside, so they might need to outsource some of that advice. But yeah, in a big council, there'll be particular specialised aspects about some applications that will be dealt with it'll be referred by the council planner who's project managing that particular application to somebody else for their input. So the last point here is about seeing planners as project managers. I think it's a really neat way to encapsulate their role within council. The first thing, the thing that happens all the way through the application is that the council planner provides advice. So in bigger councils like the City of Hobart, every day there are two what they call duty planners who are on call to talk to people about planning. So if you phone council or you come in face to face and ask to speak to a planner, then it'll be one of those two people who come down and talk to you. So they can give you help about what's in the planning scheme that might apply to you. They can give you advice about what's discretionary, or another way of putting this is what discretion is being invoked. So there might be just one or 2 points of your application where there's some discretion. So there's some room to move in terms of what council asks you to do before they give you a permit. And the council planner tends to give advice all the way through the application. So this is where it can get confusing if you get advice from somebody who doesn't end up being the assessing officer, but generally they'll try to make sure that it's the same person. And so if you call up, say you perhaps not the proponent, you're not the person putting in the application, but it might be a neighbouring property, then you'll have a letter from the assessing officer, so you'll know exactly who to call to talk about it. Of course, the usual applies in that the council planner has to be careful about what they're saying. It has to be about the planning scheme and about how it works, maybe what zones and overlays apply, what can and can't be considered. It's not the council planner's role to indicate a decision. So this is where they need to be careful about what they say, be very careful about not weighing into something on social media, be very careful to not just be biased, but not to give people a reason to think that they might be biased when they're not. So this is where it can be tricky, and planners need to bear in mind their role and the restrictions on their role. Reporting is another major job, and this is where your current task comes in, thinking about what the elements of a report are. So just to kind of go back to the scope of the planner's role before we get into the details of reporting, reporting for fairly straightforward examples is what is called delegated reporting. So you're writing a report that will be less of a full report than if it's going to Alderman for a decision, because it's pretty straightforward, and it's perhaps there are no representations, or there's just, in the case of City of Hobart, there needs to be 2 or fewer representations. In the case of Clarence City Council, any representations whatsoever that oppose the development need to go to the Alderman. So this is where it's the council planner's role to decide whether it's completely compliant with acceptable solutions, in which case it falls under Section 58 permitted report, and this means a less detailed report. If it's a Section 57 discretionary report that requires assessment against the performance criteria, then the planner needs to justify why the development application doesn't fit the acceptable solution, and needs to write a much longer, more thorough report that orients the Alderman as to what's going on. The council planner will tend to come to the meeting so that Aldermen can ask questions, and the representatives are generally given an opportunity to talk at that meeting as well. So this is an opportunity in a low stress environment for the planner, the representatives, the developer, the Alderman who are acting in their role as planning authority to try to sort out any issues. The only other thing to mention here about reporting is if the council officer is recommending a refusal, then it has to go to the Alderman to decide. And if, as part of this reporting, if people raise issues that aren't related to the development, then the planners can't have regard to those issues. So people are free to say whatever crazy thing they like, but if it's not related to a planning matter, then it will tend not to go into the report. Appeals. So I guess this is something that every council planner hopes isn't part of a job as part of a particular project, but it is the expectation that the assessing officer will be the one who gives the evidence to the tribunal. It's their project. They know it better than everybody else. They're the ones who had the conversation about it. And they've made the recommendation. So normally a recommendation for either a refusal or for a permit to be given will be accepted, but there are cases where that doesn't happen. So if a council planner recommends refusal but Aldermen do decide to give a permit, then the assessor officer isn't responsible for defending that decision. But if there's examples where the council planner will recommend that a permit be given, and then Alderman might decide on some conditions that weren't part of that council planner's recommendation, but the council planner will still need to defend them. It's also important that the council planner declare any conflict or perceived conflict of interest. So this will happen as part of the formal part of an appeal. And there might be cases where people are needed to opt out of a particular case because of either a conflict or perceived conflict of interest. There might be parts of some applications where the assessing officer needs to refer to somebody else. So in the City of Hobart, heritage experts are on hand and are often required to help make decisions. And they often crop up in appeals too, where that particular expert part of the council process is what is appealed, then somebody like the heritage officer will be the person who will defend that. So yeah, the City of Hobart has councils in-house, so it's not the role of the council planner to look at some of those specialist codes like land contamination, but the expert writes the report back to the assessing planner and that's then included. So this is a useful way to see the scope of the role of a planner within council. The planner acts as project manager and they look after a project all the way through from the actual application and initial stages through to permission, any appeals and any permit conditions. So they might need to follow up after the permit's been issued to make sure that, for example, the slate roof that was part of the permit condition does actually go on, that the screen that's there, that's an important part of the permit condition about neighbourhood privacy, it does actually go up. Here are the elements of a planner's report. There'll be some sort of preliminary assessment, a site assessment. So it'll be made clear in the planner's report what the actual proposal is and how the two of those interact, what's being proposed, where is it being proposed, what's the zone, what's the overlay, an analysis, particularly of any of the discretionary issues, done in a very methodical and thorough way, and then some conclusions about whether the permit application should be rejected or accepted. If it should be accepted, then under what conditions. So the guidance that will go into a planner's report is going to depend on who it's going to. So if it's going to the planning manager, obviously they're not going to need as much guidance as to the elements of the particular proposal compared to if it's going to alderman, in which case it will need much stronger guidance in terms of giving aldermen a clear idea of what exactly is being proposed. So the preliminary assessment is different to any pre-application inquiry. That's what happens when the application formally lands on the planner's desk, and it's a scan of the things that are being proposed. So the way that it happens is that planners tend to make a long list of all the things that are being proposed to make sure that they've got their head around everything that might trigger particular discretionary parts of the planning scheme and really understand what's being proposed. This will also help with figuring out whether there's enough information there and whether they need to, under section 54 of LUPA, to go back to the person who's made the application and say, you've missed out on shadow diagrams, or I don't think that this can be assessed until you provide X and Y. The next thing that tends to happen is a site assessment. So having understood what the development application is about, what the scope of the development is, then there's another long list of all the site characteristics. Which zone is it in? Which overlays apply? What has already been approved in terms of what's on the title? So with those two things, you've got the application, the preliminary assessment, to find out what discretions might be triggered and figure out whether there's enough information. And then the site assessment, the council planner can start putting those two things together into the report and figure out where there might be problems. So is the height of the building potentially going to shade the neighbours? If it is there enough information in there to make a decision? So this will all end up going into a report, but that initial assessment needs to be done fairly quickly in case the planner needs to go back under the timeframes that they're permitted under law to go and ask for more information. The development application might need to be advertised. So for the City of Hobart, some will comply with all the acceptable solutions and council doesn't have any choice but to give a permit for that. About 80% of the applications that go through Hobart City Council do get advertised. So there needs to be appropriate notification actually on the site as well as via other public means. So that's generally the newspaper. And there needs to be time for representations to come in, and it's the council planner's job to sift through those representation and find the matters that are relevant to planning. So people are free to write in their own words whatever they think is relevant, but it might not be relevant to council planning. They might have a beef with the neighbours, they might just not like the look of it, or they might actually be writing in support of the development. So they might think that it was important for the economic prosperity of the area. These are not matters relevant to planning outcomes. So it's the council planner's job to read through all of those and figure out what's relevant and what needs to be included in the report. They might need to go and visit the site. So particularly in terms of representations, it might be that the representatives might just need to be heard. And so sometimes a planner will meet the representative or tours, more than one person on site, and that can be useful in their role of managing the project. So it might be that the representatives are able to withdraw their representation based on what happens on site, that maybe they misunderstood, or maybe there's some way in which they can be appeased. And so council planners often talk about how useful it is to have that good quality face-to-face conversation, potentially on site, and deal with some issues early so that they don't escalate and perhaps end up in appeal when they could have been dealt with at an early stage of the project. One of the key roles of the council planner is to provide analysis. This goes into the report, and the level of detail really is going to depend on who the assessor, who the planning authority is in this case. So is it the planner's manager, or is it going to the alderman? And the report generally needs to tell the story about the development application with all the description of all aspects of that application that are relevant to the people who care about that. So this is going to be a fuller report for the alderman compared to someone within planning, but it also needs to describe the project that is relevant in terms of public interest, that is able to give people an understanding of what are the planning considerations and what they think are good planning outcomes, and then providing that recommendation. So, for example, in the case of making a decision about an application for a front fence, and the surrounding front fences are 1.2 metre high white picket fences on the whole, and a development application comes in for a 6 foot high block solid front fence, then as part of the analysis of that application, the council planner might go on site and take photos of surrounding front fences in the area to give a sense of what the character is, so that when they're making a recommendation in that particular case, that the application not be granted, that a permit not be given, then they can show their thinking with the evidence of what is the character of the area. So it's important to break the performance criteria down and deal with the discretions in a really rigorous and thorough way, so that if it does go to appeal and people do challenge it, that the planner has done their job in terms of providing all that background and providing the reasoning. Conditions. All right, permit conditions. You already know a fair bit about this. Just a couple of points here about the planner's role in the whole process. Obviously, the overriding thing that you will have picked up in the manual is that you can't write a condition for something that changes the nature of the application. And graduate planners need to be really careful about not letting their own opinions get in the way of what they're actually charged to do in a legal sense. So by way of an example, in terms of planning, if an application comes in a heritage area for example, a colour bond roof, where all the roofs around an existing roof of that heritage property is slate, then as the council planner, you know that it's really not going to get approval as it's currently been written with a colour bond roof. You can have a conversation with the applicant about that and say, look, here's the requirements. I don't really think what you've got here is going to get through. It's then back in the court of the applicant to either take that on board and alter the application, but you can't make it a condition that substantially changes the application, particularly in the case of something like the slate roof, where it's really expensive. You can't do something that will fundamentally change the application. So the proponent might choose to alter it, and if it's already been advertised, then re-advertise the application, which in the case of the City of Hobart is another $250. What might happen in practice if there are no representations and the proponent is happy that, for example, a slate roof go on instead of a colour bond roof, that might, for practical purposes, be the easiest way out, knowing that it's open to challenge and it's tantamount to a refusal on the original application, because council's asking for something that's substantially different and substantially more expensive. It might happen like that anyway. So the key to a condition is that it needs a time frame, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be related to a planning purpose. So you can't double up on something that's just a normal legal requirement. For example, something around Environmental Management and Pollution Control Act, for example, noise, it can't be a condition of the planning permit that you, for example, couldn't have dogs on site who might bark. That's something that would be dealt with as it arose through that different legislation. And so while council has a compliance role, that's a different part of council. It's not something that's part of the conditions that would go on a planning permit. The last thing that we need to cover here is to talk about how land surveyors might interact with council planners and their role in council planning. So there's two main ways that this happens. It happens with subdivisions where they really need to talk to council engineers to make sure that they've got their traffic, stormwater, anything that might either require to fit into an acceptable solution or be fairly sure that if it's part of discretion that they've got a solution that council engineers are happy with. So they need to be aware of anything that might be part of that particular zone and go and talk to the council engineers to make sure that they're adhering to things. So for example, there might be an issue around lot frontage. So in City of Hobart, in a residential zone, lot frontage needs to be at least 3.6 metres wide. So if you put in a subdivision application that doesn't meet that, there's going to be problems. So this is where the land surveyors might talk to both the planning staff and the engineering staff just to make sure that there aren't going to be problems which will create delays and costs as part of the assessment. The other one in which surveyors have a role in terms of council planning is in strata plans. So if a land surveyor is working for somebody to do amendments to a strata plan, then they'll need to find out what the acceptable solutions are and have a look at the actual title to see if there's anything on file that might need to be taken into account. And if there isn't anything on the file that will allow for that plan to go ahead, the strata plan to go ahead, then there'll need to be a planning permit application to make sure that that's an appropriate planning outcome in that area. Very brief, I know, but for those of you doing KGG 507, these are the main two ways in which you would be dealing with council planners. I hope this helps in terms of figuring out not just the scope of the role of a council planner, but also what goes into a planning report, and look forward to seeing your submissions.